Margaret, a 58-year-old retired nurse, was enjoying her morning coffee when her phone rang with a call that would test her generous heart and teach her valuable lessons about protecting herself from charity fraud. The caller identified himself as Officer Thompson from the Police Officers Benevolent Association and immediately began explaining how they were raising funds to provide bulletproof vests and safety equipment for police officers in her community who were putting their lives on the line every day to keep families safe. Margaret had always had tremendous respect for police officers, firefighters, and other first responders who risked their safety to protect others. During her 30-year nursing career at the local hospital's emergency department, she had worked closely with police officers and EMTs during countless emergencies and had seen firsthand the dangerous situations they faced on a regular basis. Her late husband had also been a volunteer firefighter for many years, which made her even more sympathetic to causes supporting first responders and their families. Officer Thompson spoke with authority and used specific law enforcement terminology that made him sound completely legitimate and knowledgeable about police work. He explained that their organization was working to provide life-saving equipment to officers whose departments couldn't afford the latest safety gear due to budget constraints and limited funding from local governments. Mrs. Patterson, we're reaching out to community members like yourself who understand the importance of supporting our brave men and women in uniform, Thompson said in a respectful, professional tone. These officers put their lives on the line every single day to protect families like yours, and many of them are working with outdated equipment that puts them at unnecessary risk. Thompson provided detailed information about the costs of modern police equipment, explaining that a single bulletproof vest could cost over $800 and that many smaller police departments simply didn't have the budget to provide the latest protective gear for all their officers. He painted a compelling picture of dedicated officers working dangerous jobs without adequate protection, which touched Margaret's heart and made her want to help. The caller also mentioned specific local police officers by name, claiming they had personally requested help in obtaining better equipment for their departments. He referenced recent crime incidents in Margaret's area that had been covered in local news, demonstrating apparent knowledge of local law enforcement activities and community safety concerns. Thompson asked Margaret if she would be willing to make a donation to help purchase bulletproof vests and other safety equipment for local police officers. He offered several donation levels, from $50 to $500, and explained exactly how each amount would be used to purchase specific pieces of equipment that would help keep officers safe while they protected the community. Even a $100 donation can make a real difference, Thompson explained. That amount, combined with donations from other caring community members, can help us purchase a bulletproof vest that could literally save an officer's life. We're not asking for anything you can't afford, but we hope you'll consider helping us protect those who protect us. Thompson also mentioned that the organization was recognized by the IRS as a legitimate charity and that all donations were tax-deductible. He offered to send Margaret official documentation about their charitable status and provided what sounded like legitimate tax identification numbers that would allow her to claim the donation on her taxes. Margaret was moved by the appeal and felt a strong desire to support police officers who were working to keep her community safe. The amount seemed reasonable for such an important cause, and Thompson's professional manner and detailed knowledge made the organization seem completely legitimate and trustworthy. Margaret agreed to make a $150 donation and provided her credit card information over the phone. Thompson was very appreciative and professional throughout the transaction, providing her with a confirmation number and promising that she would receive official documentation within a few days along with updates about how her donation was being used to help local officers. Thompson also mentioned that the organization would send her periodic updates about their work and might contact her occasionally with information about additional opportunities to support law enforcement in her community. He thanked her sincerely for her generosity and assured her that her donation would make a real difference in officer safety. After making the donation, Margaret felt good about supporting a cause she believed in and looked forward to receiving information about how her money was being used to help local police officers. She expected to receive thank you materials, tax documentation, and updates about equipment purchases and officer safety improvements. However, several weeks passed without any communication from the Police Officers Benevolent Association. Margaret had expected to receive official documentation tax receipts, and information about how her donation was being used, but no materials arrived in the mail or via email despite Thompson's specific promises. When Margaret tried to call the number Thompson had provided to inquire about her donation and request the promised documentation, she found that it was disconnected with no forwarding information. She also searched online for the Police Officers Benevolent Association but found that while legitimate organizations with similar names existed, none of them matched the specific organization that Thompson had claimed to represent. Margaret contacted her local police department to ask if they had heard of the organization or had any partnership relationships with them. The desk sergeant she spoke with had never heard of the specific organization and explained that their department had all the equipment they needed through their regular budget and didn't work with outside fundraising groups for basic safety equipment. Margaret realized with growing anger and disappointment that she had been scammed by criminals who were exploiting people's respect for law enforcement to steal money intended for a worthy cause. She felt particularly violated because the scammers had used her genuine desire to support police officers against her, taking advantage of her patriotic feelings and community spirit. Margaret immediately contacted her credit card company to report the fraudulent charge and request assistance in recovering her money. The customer service representative was very understanding and helpful, explaining that fake police charity scams are unfortunately common because scammers know that most people want to support law enforcement and first responders. The credit card company reversed the fraudulent charge and provided Margaret with additional security measures to protect her account from future fraud. They also explained that legitimate police charities typically don't make unsolicited phone calls asking for immediate donations and provided tips for verifying charitable organizations before making contributions. Margaret also reported the scam to the Federal Trade Commission, her state attorney general's office, and local law enforcement. The detective who took her report explained that fake police charity scams are a persistent problem and that scammers often use official-sounding names and law enforcement terminology to convince people that their organizations are legitimate. The experience taught Margaret to be much more careful about telephone solicitations, especially those claiming to represent law enforcement or other first responder organizations. She learned to always verify charitable organizations through independent sources before making donations and never to provide credit card information to unsolicited callers. Margaret continues to support legitimate law enforcement charities, but now researches organizations thoroughly through official charity rating websites and only donates to established organizations that she can verify through reliable sources. She has become an advocate for charity fraud prevention and regularly shares her story with other community members to help them avoid similar scams while continuing to support worthy causes. James, a 73-year-old retired veteran, was reading his morning newspaper when he received a phone call that initially filled him with pride but would ultimately teach him painful lessons about how scammers exploit military service and patriotic feelings. The caller identified himself as Sergeant Martinez from the Veterans Relief Foundation and immediately began thanking James for his military service and explaining how they were raising funds to help homeless veterans and military families who were struggling financially. James had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a young man and had always felt a strong bond with other veterans and military families. He understood the challenges that many veterans faced when transitioning back to civilian life and had personally witnessed how some of his fellow service members had struggled with employment, housing, and medical care after their military service ended. Throughout his life, James had consistently supported veterans organizations and military charities, believing strongly that those who had served their country deserved support and assistance when they faced difficult times. He had volunteered at VA hospitals, participated in veterans parades, and regularly donated to organizations that helped military families and homeless veterans. Sergeant Martinez spoke with military bearing and used specific military terminology and references that immediately established credibility with James. He demonstrated apparent knowledge of military life, veterans' issues, and the challenges facing former service members, which made him seem like a genuine advocate for veterans' causes. Mr. Thompson, as a fellow veteran, I know you understand the brotherhood we share and the obligation we have to help our comrades who are facing tough times, Martinez said with sincere-sounding respect for James's service. We have veterans right here in your area who are sleeping on the streets and families who can't afford basic necessities because they're still waiting for benefits or struggling to find employment. Martinez provided detailed statistics about veteran homelessness, unemployment rates among former military personnel, and the challenges facing military families dealing with deployment-related stress and financial hardship. He spoke knowledgeably about VA benefits, military disability ratings, and the bureaucratic challenges that often prevented veterans from getting the help they needed quickly. The caller explained that the Veterans Relief Foundation worked directly with local veterans and military families to provide emergency assistance, including temporary housing, food assistance, job training, and help navigating the VA system to access benefits. He claimed that their organization could provide immediate help to veterans in crisis while they worked through the often lengthy process of obtaining official government assistance. Martinez shared specific stories about local veterans they had helped, including a homeless veteran who had been living in his car and a military family facing eviction because the veteran's disability benefits had been delayed. The stories were detailed and emotionally compelling, describing situations that James knew were unfortunately common among veterans who had served their country honorably. "Sir, with your military background, you understand that we never leave a fellow soldier behind," Martinez continued with apparent sincerity. "These veterans served their country with honor, and now they need our help to get back on their feet. We're asking veterans like yourself to help us continue this mission of supporting our brothers and sisters in arms." Martinez asked James if he would be willing to make a donation to help provide emergency assistance to local veterans and military families. He offered several donation levels and explained specifically how each amount would be used. $50 could provide a week of meals for a homeless veteran, $100 could help with utility bills for a struggling military family, and $200 could provide temporary housing for a veteran transitioning off the streets. The caller also mentioned that the organization was recognized as a legitimate charity by the IRS and that all donations were tax-deductible. He provided what sounded like official tax identification numbers and offered to send James documentation about their charitable status and recent activities helping local veterans. James was deeply moved by the appeal and felt a strong moral obligation to help fellow veterans who were facing difficult circumstances. The amounts seemed reasonable for such an important cause, and Martinez's military knowledge and respectful manner made the organization seem completely legitimate and aligned with James's values. James agreed to make a $200 donation and provided his credit card information over the phone. Martinez was very respectful and appreciative throughout the transaction, using military courtesy and expressing sincere gratitude for James's continued service to the veteran community through his generous donation. Martinez also mentioned that the organization would keep James informed about their ongoing work helping local veterans and might contact him occasionally with updates about successful cases and opportunities for additional support. He provided James with a confirmation number and promised that he would receive official documentation and tax receipts within a week. After making the donation, James felt proud about continuing to serve his fellow veterans and looked forward to receiving information about how his money was being used to help local military families and homeless veterans in his community. He expected to receive materials showing the impact of his contribution and updates about veterans who had been helped. However, 2 weeks passed without any communication from the Veterans Relief Foundation despite Martinez's specific promises to provide documentation and updates. James had expected to receive thank you letters, tax documentation, and stories about veterans who had been helped with his donation, but no materials arrived. When James tried to call the number Martinez had provided to inquire about his donation and request the promised information, he found that it was disconnected with no alternative contact method. He also searched extensively online for the Veterans Relief Foundation but couldn't find any legitimate organization with that exact name or any record of their charitable activities. James contacted several legitimate veterans organizations in his area to ask if they had heard of the Veterans Relief Foundation or had any partnership relationships with them. None of the established veterans groups he contacted had ever heard of the organization or worked with them in any capacity. James also contacted the local VA office to inquire about the organization and ask if they referred veterans to outside charities for emergency assistance. The VA representative explained that they had procedures for helping veterans in crisis and didn't work with outside fundraising organizations that solicited donations over the phone. James realized with deep anger and sense of betrayal that he had been scammed by criminals who were specifically exploiting veterans' loyalty to each other and their desire to help fellow service members. He felt particularly violated because the scammers had used his military service and patriotic values against him, taking advantage of the brotherhood and mutual support that was central to military culture. James immediately contacted his credit card company to report the fraudulent charge and demand a refund. The customer service representative was very understanding and sympathetic, explaining that fake veterans charity scams are unfortunately common because scammers know that veterans are particularly motivated to help other veterans and military families. The credit card company immediately reversed the fraudulent charge and provided James with enhanced security measures for his account. They also explained that legitimate veterans charities typically don't make unsolicited phone calls asking for immediate donations and provided resources for verifying military and veterans organizations before making contributions. James also reported the scam to the Federal Trade Commission, his state attorney general's office, the Better Business Bureau, and local law enforcement. He also contacted the VA's fraud hotline to report the scam and help protect other veterans from similar fraud attempts. The authorities explained that fake veterans charity scams are a persistent problem that specifically targets veterans and military families because scammers know these populations are motivated to help fellow service members. They praised James for reporting the scam thoroughly and provided information about how to verify legitimate veterans organizations. The experience taught James to be much more careful about telephone solicitations, especially those claiming to represent veterans organizations or military charities. He learned to always verify organizations through independent sources and never to provide financial information to unsolicited callers, regardless of how legitimate they sound or how much they seem to understand military culture. James continues to support legitimate veterans organizations but now researches them thoroughly through official charity rating websites and veteran service organizations before making any donations. He has become an advocate for veteran fraud prevention and regularly shares his story with other veterans to help them avoid similar scams while continuing to support worthy veterans' causes. Susan, a 45-year-old working mother of two, was preparing dinner when she received a phone call that would challenge her desire to help children while teaching her important lessons about verifying charitable organizations. The caller identified herself as Maria from the Children's Emergency Relief Fund and immediately began describing the urgent need for donations to help children who had been affected by recent natural disasters and were facing hunger, homelessness, and medical emergencies. Susan had always been particularly sensitive to stories about children in need, having volunteered at local schools and participated in community programs that supported underprivileged youth. As a mother herself, she understood the vulnerability of children and felt a strong moral obligation to help when she learned about kids who were suffering or lacking basic necessities. Maria spoke with genuine-sounding emotion and used specific details about recent disasters and their impact on children and families. She described situations where children had lost their homes, were separated from their parents, and needed immediate assistance with food, shelter, and medical care to survive and recover from traumatic experiences. Mrs. Anderson, I'm calling today because we desperately need help for children who have lost everything in recent floods and storms, Maria said with apparent urgency and concern. These are innocent children who had no control over what happened to them, and they're depending on caring people like you to help them get through this terrible time. Maria provided detailed information about the Children's Emergency Relief Fund, explaining that they specialized in providing rapid response assistance to children affected by natural disasters, family emergencies, and crisis situations. She claimed that their organization could respond quickly to emergency situations while larger charities were still organizing their relief efforts. The caller described specific cases of children they had helped, including orphan children who needed temporary care, kids who required emergency medical treatment, and families with children who needed immediate housing assistance. The stories were heart-wrenching and detailed, describing situations that Susan knew were unfortunately real consequences of natural disasters and family emergencies. Maria explained that the Children's Emergency Relief Fund worked directly with local emergency responders, hospitals, and social service agencies to identify children who needed immediate assistance and could provide help within hours of receiving donations rather than weeks or months like larger organizations. Every minute counts when a child is in danger, Maria continued with apparent sincerity. While big charities are processing paperwork and organizing committees, We can get food to a hungry child or medical care to a sick kid immediately. But we need donations from caring people to make that possible. Maria asked Susan if she would be willing to make a donation to help provide emergency assistance to children in crisis. She offered several donation levels and explained specifically how each amount would be used. $25 could provide meals for a child for a week, $50 could pay for emergency medical care, and $100 could provide temporary housing for a child who had lost their home. The caller also mentioned that the organization was recognized as a legitimate charity and that all donations were tax-deductible. She offered to send Susan documentation about their charitable status and provided what sounded like official reference numbers that would allow her to track her donation and claim it on her taxes. Susan was deeply moved by the stories about children in need and felt a strong desire to help kids who were facing emergency situations through no fault of their own. The donation amounts seemed reasonable for such an urgent cause, and Maria's emotional sincerity and detailed knowledge made the organization seem completely legitimate and effective. Susan agreed to make a $75 donation and provided her credit card information over the phone. Maria was very appreciative and emotional, thanking Susan for her compassion and assuring her that her donation would make an immediate difference in the life of a child who desperately needed help. Maria also promised to send Susan updates about children who had been helped with her donation and mentioned that the organization would keep her informed about ongoing emergency situations where additional support might be needed. She provided Susan with a confirmation number and assured her that she would receive official documentation within a few days. After making the donation, Susan felt good about helping children in emergency situations and looked forward to receiving information about how her money was being used to provide immediate assistance to kids who needed help. She expected to receive materials showing the impact of her contribution and updates about children who had been helped. However, several weeks passed without any communication from the Children's Emergency Relief Fund despite Maria's specific promises to provide updates and documentation. Susan had expected to receive thank you materials, tax receipts, and stories about children who had been helped with her donation, but no materials arrived. When Susan tried to call the number Maria had provided to inquire about her donation and request information about the children who had been helped, she found that it was disconnected with no forwarding information. She also searched extensively online for the Children's Emergency Relief Fund, but couldn't find any legitimate organization with that name or any record of their disaster relief activities. Susan contacted several established children's charities and disaster relief organizations to ask if they had heard of the Children's Emergency Relief Fund or had any partnership relationships with them. None of the legitimate organizations she contacted had ever heard of the charity or worked with them in providing emergency assistance to children. Susan also contacted local emergency management authorities and social service agencies to ask if they worked with outside charities for child emergency assistance. They explained that they had established procedures for helping children in crisis situations and didn't typically work with unknown charitable organizations that solicited donations over the phone. Susan realized with growing anger and disappointment that she had been scammed by criminals who were exploiting people's natural desire to help children in need. She felt particularly violated because the scammers had used her maternal instincts and compassion for children against her, taking advantage of her genuine concern for kids who might be suffering. Susan immediately contacted her credit card company to report the fraudulent charge and request assistance in recovering her money. The customer service representative was very understanding and helpful, explaining that fake children's charity scams are unfortunately common because scammers know that appeals involving children are particularly effective at motivating people to donate quickly without doing thorough research. The credit card company reversed the fraudulent charge and provided Susan with additional security measures for her account. They also explained that legitimate children's charities typically don't make unsolicited phone calls asking for immediate donations and provided resources for verifying charitable organizations before making contributions. Susan also reported the scam to the Federal Trade Commission, her state attorney general's office, and local law enforcement. She also contacted national children's advocacy organizations to report the scam and help protect other parents from similar fraud attempts targeting their desire to help children. The authorities explained that fake children's charity scams are particularly insidious because they exploit people's natural protective instincts toward children and often create false urgency that prevents donors from doing proper research before contributing. They praised Susan for reporting the scam and provided information about how to verify legitimate children's charities. The experience taught Susan to be much more careful about telephone solicitations, especially those involving emotional appeals about children in crisis. She learned to always verify charitable organizations through independent sources and never to provide financial information to unsolicited callers, regardless of how urgent the situation sounds or how much the caller seems to care about children. Susan continues to support legitimate children's charities but now researches them thoroughly through official charity rating websites and established child advocacy organizations before making any donations. She has become an advocate for charity fraud prevention and regularly shares her story with other parents to help them avoid similar scams while continuing to support worthy causes that genuinely help children in need. Robert's day started normally until he received a phone call that would test his faith and teach him valuable lessons about protecting himself from religious charity fraud. The caller identified himself as Pastor Williams from the Christian Disaster Relief Ministry and immediately began explaining how they were raising funds to help families affected by recent hurricanes rebuild their homes and communities with the support of Christian donors across the country. Robert, a 68-year-old retiree, had been an active member of his local Methodist church for over 40 years and had always believed strongly in helping others through Christian charity and community service. He had participated in numerous church mission trips, volunteer projects, and fundraising efforts throughout his life and understood the importance of putting faith into action by helping those in need. Pastor Williams spoke with apparent religious conviction and used biblical references and Christian terminology that immediately resonated with Robert's faith and values. He demonstrated knowledge of Scripture and spoke about the Christian obligation to help those who were suffering, which aligned perfectly with Robert's understanding of his religious duties and moral obligations. Brother Robert, I'm calling today because the Lord has placed it on my heart to reach out to faithful Christians like yourself who understand our biblical obligation to help those who are suffering. Pastor Williams said with apparent sincerity and religious authority. Matthew 25 verse 35 tells us, "I was a stranger and you invited me in." And that's exactly what we're trying to do for families who have lost everything in these terrible storms. Pastor Williams provided detailed information about recent hurricane damage and the ongoing recovery efforts in affected communities. He described specific situations where Christian families had lost their homes, churches had been destroyed, and entire communities were struggling to rebuild while maintaining their faith during incredibly difficult times. The caller explained that the Christian Disaster Relief Ministry specialized in providing assistance specifically to Christian families and church communities that had been affected by natural disasters. He claimed that their organization could work directly with local pastors and church leaders to identify families in need and provide assistance that reflected Christian values and principles. Pastor Williams shared touching stories about families they had helped, including a pastor whose church had been destroyed and was trying to continue serving his congregation while living in a temporary shelter, and a Christian family with young children who had lost their home but continued to trust in God's plan for their lives. Brother, these are people of faith who are not asking for handouts, but desperately need help from their brothers and sisters in Christ. Pastor Williams continued with apparent emotion. They're praying for God to provide, and I believe He's calling faithful Christians like you to be the answer to those prayers. The caller also quoted relevant Bible verses about charity, stewardship, and helping those in need, demonstrating apparent biblical knowledge and speaking with the authority of someone who seemed to genuinely understand Christian theology and the importance of charitable giving in the Christian faith. Pastor Williams asked Robert if he would be willing to make a donation to help provide emergency assistance to Christian families who were struggling to rebuild their lives after losing everything in recent hurricanes. He offered several donation levels and explained how each amount would be used according to Christian principles of stewardship and accountability. A gift of $100 can help a Christian family get temporary housing while they rebuild, Pastor Williams explained. $200 can help a destroyed church purchase basic supplies to continue serving their community. Every dollar goes directly to helping fellow believers who are trusting God to provide for their needs through the generosity of faithful Christians like yourself. The caller also mentioned that the organization was recognized as a legitimate religious charity and that all donations were tax-deductible. He offered to send Robert documentation about their charitable status and provided what sounded like official religious organization registration numbers. Pastor Williams also suggested that Robert could designate his donation as a memorial gift in honor of his late wife. mentioning that many donors found comfort in knowing that their gifts were helping others in the name of loved ones who had gone home to be with the Lord. Robert was deeply moved by the religious appeal and felt a strong spiritual obligation to help fellow Christians who were facing difficult circumstances. The biblical references resonated with his faith, and Pastor Williams's apparent knowledge of Scripture and Christian values made the organization seem completely legitimate and aligned with Robert's religious beliefs. Robert agreed to make a $150 donation in memory of his late wife and provided his credit card information over the phone. Pastor Williams was very appreciative and spiritual, thanking Robert for his faithfulness and assuring him that his donation would be used according to Christian principles to help fellow believers who desperately needed assistance. Pastor Williams also promised to send Robert updates about families who had been helped with his donation and mentioned that the organization would keep him in their prayers and might contact him occasionally with information about additional opportunities to serve others through Christian charity. After making the donation, Robert felt spiritually fulfilled about helping fellow Christians and looked forward to receiving information about how his memorial gift was being used to help hurricane victims rebuild their lives and communities with faith and hope. However, several weeks passed without any communication from the Christian Disaster Relief Ministry despite Pastor Williams's specific promises to provide updates and documentation. Robert had expected to receive thank you materials, tax receipts, and stories about Christian families who had been helped with his memorial donation. When Robert tried to call the number Pastor Williams had provided to inquire about his donation and request information about the families who had been helped, he found that it was disconnected with no alternative contact method. He also searched online for the Christian Disaster Relief Ministry, but couldn't find any legitimate religious organization with that name. Robert contacted his own pastor and several other local churches to ask if they had heard of the Christian Disaster Relief Ministry or had any partnership relationships with them for disaster relief work. None of the legitimate religious organizations he contacted had ever heard of the charity or worked with them in providing hurricane relief assistance. Robert also contacted established Christian disaster relief organizations like Samaritan's Purse and the Salvation Army to ask if they were familiar with the organization. They confirmed that they had never heard of the Christian Disaster Relief Ministry and advised Robert that legitimate religious charities typically work through established denominational networks rather than making unsolicited phone calls. Robert realized with deep anger and spiritual pain that he had been scammed by criminals who were exploiting people's religious faith and desire to help fellow believers. He felt particularly violated because the scammers had used his Christian faith against him, taking advantage of his biblical understanding of charity and his desire to honor his late wife's memory through giving. Robert immediately contacted his credit card company to report the fraudulent charge and request assistance in recovering his money. The customer service representative was very understanding and sympathetic, explaining that fake religious charity scams are unfortunately common because scammers know that people of faith are particularly motivated to help others and may be less likely to question appeals that use religious language and biblical references. The credit card company reversed the fraudulent charge and provided Robert with additional security measures for his account. They also explained that legitimate religious charities typically don't make unsolicited phone calls and provided resources for verifying religious organizations before making contributions. Robert also reported the scam to the Federal Trade Commission, his state attorney general's office, and local law enforcement. He also contacted his denominational headquarters to report the scam and help protect other church members from similar fraud attempts that exploit religious faith and biblical principles. The authorities explained that fake religious charity scams are particularly harmful because they exploit people's deeply held spiritual beliefs and can damage their trust in legitimate religious organizations and charitable giving. They praised Robert for reporting the scam and provided information about how to verify legitimate religious charities. The experience taught Robert to be much more careful about telephone solicitations, especially those that use religious language and biblical references to create credibility. He learned to always verify religious organizations through his own church leadership and established denominational networks before making any donations. Robert continues to support legitimate Christian charities but now researches them thoroughly through his church and established religious charity rating organizations before making any donations. He has become an advocate for protecting fellow believers from charity fraud and regularly shares his story with other church members to help them avoid similar scams while continuing to practice biblical principles of charitable giving. Linda, a 42-year-old elementary school teacher, was grading papers at her kitchen table when she received a phone call that would challenge her environmental consciousness and teach her important lessons about verifying organizations that claim to protect the planet. The caller identified himself as Dr. Mitchell from the Global Wildlife Protection Alliance and immediately began describing urgent environmental crises and the desperate need for donations to save endangered species from extinction. Linda had always been passionate about environmental protection and wildlife conservation, teaching her students about the importance of protecting natural habitats and endangered species. She regularly participated in local environmental cleanup projects, recycled diligently, and tried to live sustainably to reduce her impact on the planet. Dr. Mitchell spoke with apparent scientific authority and used specific environmental terminology and statistics that seemed to demonstrate expertise in wildlife conservation and environmental science. He described urgent threats to various endangered species and painted a compelling picture of animals that were on the brink of extinction without immediate intervention and protection efforts. Ms. Johnson, I'm calling today because we're facing an environmental crisis that requires immediate action from people who care about preserving our planet's biodiversity, Dr. Mitchell said with apparent urgency and scientific authority. We have multiple species that could disappear forever within the next few months if we don't act quickly to protect their remaining habitats and implement emergency conservation measures. Dr. Mitchell provided detailed information about specific endangered species, including population numbers, habitat destruction rates, and the specific threats they faced from climate change, deforestation, and human development. He spoke knowledgeably about conservation biology and used scientific terminology that made him sound like a legitimate wildlife researcher. The caller explained that the Global Wildlife Protection Alliance specialized in rapid response conservation efforts that could implement emergency protection measures for endangered species, while larger organizations were still organizing their long-term conservation programs. He claimed that their organization could act quickly to save species that were facing immediate extinction threats. Dr. Mitchell shared specific stories about animals they had helped save, including a population of rare birds that had been rescued from habitat destruction and a group of endangered marine mammals that had been protected from pollution and hunting. The stories were detailed and emotionally compelling, describing conservation successes that Linda hoped were representative of effective environmental protection work. Every day we delay action, we lose more species forever, Dr. Mitchell continued with apparent passion for conservation. These animals have no voice and no political power, so they depend entirely on caring people like you who understand that once a species is extinct, it's gone forever. We can't bring them back, but we can still save the ones that remain if we act immediately. The caller also referenced recent environmental news stories and scientific studies about species extinction rates, climate change impacts, and habitat destruction that Linda had read about in environmental magazines and news sources. This apparent knowledge of current environmental issues added credibility to his claims about urgent conservation needs. Dr. Mitchell asked Linda if she would be willing to make a donation to help fund emergency conservation efforts that could save endangered species from immediate extinction. He offered several donation levels and explained specifically how each amount would be used to protect animals and their habitats. A donation of $75 can fund habitat protection for an endangered species for 1 month, Dr. Mitchell explained with apparent scientific precision. $150 can support our rapid response team for emergency wildlife rescues. Every dollar goes directly to on-the-ground conservation efforts that are literally saving species from extinction. The caller also mentioned that the organization was recognized as a legitimate environmental charity and that all donations were tax-deductible. He offered to send Linda documentation about their conservation work and provided what sounded like official environmental organization registration numbers. Dr. Mitchell also appealed to Linda's role as a teacher, suggesting that her donation would help preserve wildlife and natural environments that future generations of students would be able to learn about and experience. He mentioned that the organization provided educational materials that teachers could use to help students understand conservation and environmental protection. Linda was deeply moved by the environmental appeal and felt a strong moral obligation to help protect endangered species and preserve biodiversity for future generations. The scientific terminology and apparent expertise made the organization seem completely legitimate and effective in conservation work. Linda agreed to make a $100 donation and provided her credit card information over the phone. Dr. Mitchell was very appreciative and passionate, thanking Linda for her environmental consciousness and assuring her that her donation would make an immediate difference in protecting endangered species that desperately needed help. Dr. Mitchell also promised to send Linda updates about conservation successes achieved with her donation and mentioned that the organization would keep her informed about ongoing environmental crises where additional support might be needed. He provided educational materials that she could use in her classroom to teach students about wildlife conservation. After making the donation, Linda felt good about supporting environmental protection and looked forward to receiving information about conservation efforts and endangered species that had been helped with her contribution. She expected to receive materials showing the impact of her donation and updates about successful conservation projects. However, several weeks passed without any communication from the Global Wildlife Protection Alliance despite Dr. Mitchell's specific promises to provide updates and educational materials. Linda had expected to receive documentation about their conservation work, tax receipts, and information about species that had been helped with her donation. When Linda tried to call the number Dr. Mitchell had provided to inquire about her donation and request the promised conservation updates, she found that it was disconnected with no forwarding information. She also searched extensively online for the Global Wildlife Protection Alliance, but couldn't find any legitimate environmental organization with that name. Linda contacted several established environmental and wildlife conservation organizations to ask if they had heard of the Global Wildlife Protection Alliance or had any partnership relationships with them. None of the legitimate conservation groups she contacted had ever heard of the organization or worked with them in protecting endangered species. Linda also contacted local zoos, wildlife refuges, and environmental education centers to ask if they were familiar with the organization or had received any conservation materials from them. None of the legitimate wildlife organizations she contacted had any record of the Global Wildlife Protection Alliance or their claimed conservation activities. Linda realized with growing anger and disappointment that she had been scammed by criminals who were exploiting people's environmental consciousness and concern for endangered species. She felt particularly violated because the scammers had used her genuine care for the environment against her, taking advantage of her desire to protect wildlife and preserve the planet for future generations. Linda immediately contacted her credit card company to report the fraudulent charge and request assistance in recovering her money. The customer service representative was very understanding and helpful, explaining that fake environmental charity scams are unfortunately common because scammers know that environmentally conscious people are motivated to act quickly when they believe animals or ecosystems are facing immediate threats. The credit card company reversed the fraudulent charge and provided Linda with additional security measures for her account. They also explained that legitimate environmental charities typically don't make unsolicited phone calls asking for immediate donations and provided resources for verifying conservation organizations before making contributions. Linda also reported the scam to the Federal Trade Commission, her state attorney general's office, and local law enforcement. She also contacted established environmental advocacy organizations to report the scam and help protect other environmentally conscious people from similar fraud attempts. The authorities explained that fake environmental charity scams are particularly harmful because they exploit people's genuine concern for the planet and can damage trust in legitimate conservation organizations that are doing important work to protect endangered species and natural habitats. The experience taught Linda to be much more careful about telephone solicitations, especially those that create false urgency about environmental crises. She learned to always verify environmental organizations through established conservation groups and official charity rating websites before making any donations. Linda continues to support legitimate environmental and wildlife conservation organizations, but now researches them thoroughly through established environmental advocacy groups and charity watchdog organizations before making any donations. She has become an advocate for protecting environmentally conscious people from charity fraud and regularly shares her story with fellow teachers and environmental activists to help them avoid similar scams while continuing to support genuine conservation efforts. David, a 39-year-old construction worker, was enjoying a quiet Saturday morning when he received a phone call that would test his desire to help fellow working people and teach him valuable lessons about labor union charity fraud. The caller identified himself as Mike Rodriguez from the Workers' Emergency Assistance Fund, and immediately began explaining how they were raising funds to help union workers and their families who had been injured on the job or were facing financial hardship due to workplace accidents and unsafe working conditions. David had been a proud member of his local construction workers union for over 15 years and understood firsthand the dangers and challenges that blue-collar workers faced every day on job sites. He had witnessed serious accidents, knew workers who had been injured, and understood how quickly a workplace injury could devastate a family's financial security and future prospects. Throughout his career, David had always supported worker solidarity and believed strongly in helping fellow union members who were facing difficult times. He had participated in fundraising efforts for injured coworkers, supported striking workers, and understood the importance of workers looking out for each other in an often dangerous and unpredictable industry. Mike Rodriguez spoke with apparent knowledge of union issues and used specific labor terminology and references that immediately established credibility with David. He demonstrated understanding of workplace safety concerns, workers' compensation issues, and the financial challenges facing union families, which made him seem like a genuine advocate for working people and their families. Brother David, I'm calling today because I know you understand what it's like to work hard for a living and the risks that working people face every day just trying to provide for their families, Rodriguez said with apparent sincerity and working-class solidarity. We have union workers right here in your area who have been seriously injured on the job and are struggling to pay their bills while they're fighting for the workers' compensation benefits they deserve. Rodriguez provided detailed information about workplace accidents, injury rates in the construction industry, and the challenges that injured workers faced when dealing with insurance companies and workers' compensation systems. He spoke knowledgeably about the bureaucratic delays and legal battles that often prevented injured workers from getting the financial support they needed quickly. The caller explained that the Workers' Emergency Assistance Fund specialized in providing immediate financial help to union workers and their families who were facing crisis situations while they waited for official workers' compensation benefits or disability payments that could take months or years to process. Rodriguez shared specific stories about workers they had helped, including a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding and needed help paying rent while he recovered, and a factory worker who had been injured by machinery and needed assistance with medical bills that weren't covered by insurance. David, you know how it is. When a working man gets hurt, the bills don't stop coming just because he can't work, Rodriguez continued with apparent understanding of working-class struggles. These guys have families to feed and mortgages to pay, and they can't wait months for the insurance companies and lawyers to sort everything out. They need help right now, today, to keep their families together. The caller also referenced recent workplace safety incidents that had been covered in local news and mentioned specific unions and job sites that David recognized, demonstrating apparent knowledge of local labor issues and working conditions in his area. Rodriguez asked David if he would be willing to make a donation to help provide emergency financial assistance to injured union workers and their families. He offered several donation levels and explained specifically how each amount would be used to help working families during their most difficult times. A donation of $50 can help a family buy groceries for a week while the breadwinner is out of work, Rodriguez explained. $100 can help with rent or mortgage payments so a family doesn't lose their home while they're waiting for workers' comp benefits. Every dollar goes directly to helping working families who are struggling through no fault of their own. The caller also mentioned that the organization was recognized as a legitimate labor charity and that all donations were tax-deductible. He offered to send David documentation about their charitable status and provided what sounded like official labor organization registration numbers. Rodriguez also appealed to David's union solidarity, explaining that supporting injured workers was part of the brotherhood and mutual assistance that made the labor movement strong. He suggested that David's donation would demonstrate the same solidarity that unions had always represented. David was moved by the appeal and felt a strong obligation to help fellow union workers who were facing financial hardship due to workplace injuries. The amounts seemed reasonable for such an important cause, and Rodriguez's apparent knowledge of labor issues and working-class struggles made the organization seem completely legitimate and aligned with David's values. David agreed to make a $75 donation and provided his credit card information over the phone. Rodriguez was very appreciative and spoke with working-class camaraderie, thanking David for his solidarity and assuring him that his donation would make an immediate difference in the life of an injured worker's family. Rodriguez also promised to send David updates about workers who had been helped with his donation and mentioned that the organization would keep him informed about ongoing cases where additional support might be needed. He provided David with a confirmation number and assured him that he would receive official documentation within a few days. After making the donation, David felt good about supporting fellow union workers and looked forward to receiving information about how his money was being used to help injured workers and their families during difficult times. He expected to receive materials showing the impact of his contribution and updates about workers who had been helped. However, several weeks passed without any communication from the Workers' Emergency Assistance Fund despite Rodriguez's specific promises to provide updates and documentation. David had expected to receive thank you materials, tax receipts, and stories about injured workers who had been helped with his donation. When David tried to call the number Rodriguez had provided to inquire about his donation and request information about the workers who had been helped, he found that it was disconnected with no forwarding information. He also searched online for the Workers' Emergency Assistance Fund, but couldn't find any legitimate labor organization with that name. David contacted his own union hall and several other local unions to ask if they had heard of the Workers' Emergency Assistance Fund or had any partnership relationships with them for helping injured workers. None of the legitimate labor organizations he contacted had ever heard of the charity or worked with them in providing assistance to injured union members. David also contacted established workers' assistance programs and labor advocacy organizations to ask if they were familiar with the Workers' Emergency Assistance Fund. They confirmed that they had never heard of the organization and advised David that legitimate labor assistance programs typically work through established union networks rather than making unsolicited phone calls. David realized with deep anger and sense of betrayal that he had been scammed by criminals who were exploiting workers' solidarity and their desire to help fellow union members. He felt particularly violated because the scammers had used his union loyalty and working-class values against him, taking advantage of the brotherhood and mutual support that was central to labor movement culture. David immediately contacted his credit card company to report the fraudulent charge and demand a refund. The customer service representative was very understanding and sympathetic, explaining that fake workers' charity scams are unfortunately common because scammers know that union members are particularly motivated to help fellow workers and may trust appeals that use labor terminology and references. The credit card company immediately reversed the fraudulent charge and provided David with enhanced security measures for his account. They also explained that legitimate workers' assistance programs typically don't make unsolicited phone calls asking for immediate donations and provided resources for verifying labor organizations before making contributions. David also reported the scam to the Federal Trade Commission, his state attorney general's office, local law enforcement, and his union's fraud prevention office. The union representative who took his report explained that fake workers' charity scams specifically target union members because scammers know that workers are motivated to help fellow union members and their families. The authorities explained that fake labor charity scams are particularly harmful because they exploit the solidarity and mutual assistance that are fundamental values in the labor movement. They praised David for reporting the scam thoroughly and provided information about how to verify legitimate workers' assistance programs. The experience taught David to be much more careful about telephone solicitations, especially those claiming to represent workers' organizations or labor charities. He learned to always verify organizations through his own union leadership and established labor networks before making any donations. David continues to support legitimate workers' assistance programs, but now researches them thoroughly through his union and established labor advocacy organizations before making any donations. He has become an advocate for protecting fellow workers from charity fraud and regularly shares his story with other union members to help them avoid similar scams while continuing to support worthy causes that genuinely help injured workers and their families. Carol, a 56-year-old office administrator, was relaxing at home when she received a phone call that would test her compassion for seniors and teach her important lessons about elder care charity fraud. The caller identified herself as Nancy Peterson from the Senior Citizens Emergency Support Foundation and immediately began describing the urgent need for donations to help elderly people who were living alone, facing medical emergencies, and struggling with poverty during their golden years. Carol had always been particularly concerned about the welfare of elderly people, having cared for her own aging parents before they passed away. She understood the challenges that seniors faced with fixed incomes, rising medical costs, and social isolation, and she felt a strong moral obligation to help elderly people who might not have family members to support them. Nancy Peterson spoke with apparent knowledge of senior issues and used specific terminology related to elder care, Medicare, Social Security, and the challenges facing aging populations. She demonstrated understanding of the unique vulnerabilities that elderly people faced and spoke with apparent compassion for seniors who were struggling with health and financial problems. Mrs. Thompson, I'm calling today because we have elderly people right here in your community who are facing terrible situations that most people don't even know about, Peterson said with apparent concern and urgency. We have seniors who can't afford their medications, elderly people who are going without heat in the winter because they can't pay their utility bills, and isolated seniors who haven't had a visitor or phone call in weeks. Peterson provided detailed statistics about senior poverty, elder abuse, and the growing number of elderly people who were living alone without adequate support systems. She spoke knowledgeably about Medicare gaps, prescription drug costs, and the insufficient resources available through government programs for seniors. The caller explained that the Senior Citizens Emergency Support Foundation specialized in providing immediate assistance to elderly people who were facing crisis situations and couldn't get help quickly through traditional government programs or social services that often had long waiting lists and complex application processes. Peterson shared heart-wrenching stories about seniors they had helped, including an elderly woman who had been choosing between buying food and purchasing her heart medication, and an elderly man who had been living without heat because he couldn't afford his heating bill and was too proud to ask for help from his family. Carol, these are people who worked hard their entire lives, raised families, and contributed to their communities, Peterson continued with apparent emotion. They deserve to live their final years with dignity and basic necessities, not struggling to survive on inadequate Social Security benefits while facing medical bills they can't afford. The caller also referenced recent news stories about elder abuse, senior scams, and the increasing cost of health care for aging populations that Carol had read about and seen on television. This apparent knowledge of current senior issues added credibility to her claims about urgent needs in the elderly community. Peterson asked Carol if she would be willing to make a donation to help provide emergency assistance to elderly people who were facing immediate crisis situations. She offered several donation levels and explained specifically how each amount would be used to help seniors with their most pressing needs. A donation of $60 can help an elderly person pay for prescription medications for a month, Peterson explained with apparent precision. $120 can help a senior pay their heating bill so they don't have to choose between staying warm and buying food. Every dollar goes directly to helping elderly people who are struggling to survive on fixed incomes. The caller also mentioned that the organization was recognized as a legitimate charity focused on senior services and that all donations were tax-deductible. She offered to send Carol documentation about their charitable work and provided what sounded like official senior services organization registration numbers. Peterson also appealed to Carol's own experience with aging parents, suggesting that her donation would help seniors who might not have caring family members like Carol had been for her own parents. She mentioned that many donors found comfort in knowing they were helping elderly people who reminded them of their own loved ones. Carol was deeply moved by the appeal and felt a strong emotional connection to the stories about elderly people facing difficult circumstances. The references to her own experiences caring for aging parents resonated strongly, and Peterson's apparent knowledge of senior issues made the organization seem completely legitimate and effective. Carol agreed to make a $100 donation and provided her credit card information over the phone. Peterson was very appreciative and emotional, thanking Carol for her compassion and assuring her that her donation would make an immediate difference in the life of an elderly person who desperately needed help. Peterson also promised to send Carol updates about seniors who had been helped with her donation and mentioned that the organization would keep her informed about ongoing situations where elderly people needed additional support. She provided Carol with a confirmation number and assured her that she would receive official documentation within a few days. After making the donation, Carol felt good about helping elderly people and looked forward to receiving information about how her money was being used to provide assistance to seniors who were facing difficult circumstances. She expected to receive materials showing the impact of her contribution and updates about elderly people who had been helped. However, Several weeks passed without any communication from the Senior Citizens Emergency Support Foundation despite Peterson's specific promises to provide updates and documentation. Carol had expected to receive thank you materials, tax receipts, and stories about seniors who had been helped with her donation. When Carol tried to call the number Peterson had provided to inquire about her donation and request information about the elderly people who had been helped, she found that it was disconnected with no alternative contact method. She also searched extensively online for the Senior Citizens Emergency Support Foundation but couldn't find any legitimate senior services organization with that name. Carol contacted several established senior advocacy organizations and elder care agencies to ask if they had heard of the Senior Citizens Emergency Support Foundation or had any partnership relationships with them. None of the legitimate organizations she contacted had ever heard of the charity or worked with them in providing assistance to elderly people. Carol also contacted local area agency on aging offices and senior centers to ask if they were familiar with the organization or had received any assistance from them for elderly clients. None of the legitimate senior services providers she contacted had any record of the Senior Citizens Emergency Support Foundation or their claimed activities. Carol realized with growing anger and disappointment that she had been scammed by criminals who were exploiting people's compassion for elderly people and their desire to help seniors who might be struggling. She felt particularly violated because the scammers had used her own experiences caring for aging parents against her, taking advantage of her emotional connection to senior issues. Carol immediately contacted her credit card company to report the fraudulent charge and request assistance in recovering her money. The customer service representative was very understanding and helpful, explaining that fake senior charity scams are unfortunately common because scammers know that many people have emotional connections to elderly family members and are motivated to help seniors who might be in difficult situations. The credit card company reversed the fraudulent charge and provided Carol with additional security measures for her account. They also explained that legitimate senior services organizations typically don't make unsolicited phone calls asking for immediate donations and provided resources for verifying elderly care charities before making contributions. Carol also reported the scam to the Federal Trade Commission, her state attorney general's office, and local law enforcement. She also contacted established senior advocacy organizations to report the scam and help protect other people from similar fraud attempts targeting their concern for elderly people. The authorities explained that fake senior charity scams are particularly harmful because they exploit people's natural concern for vulnerable elderly people and can damage trust in legitimate organizations that provide essential services to aging populations. The experience taught Carol to be much more careful about telephone solicitations, especially those involving emotional appeals about elderly people in crisis situations. She learned to always verify senior services organizations through established elder care agencies and official charity rating websites before making any donations. Carol continues to support legitimate senior advocacy organizations and elder care charities, but now researches them thoroughly through established aging services networks and charity watchdog organizations before making any donations. She has become an advocate for protecting people from elder care charity fraud and regularly shares her story to help others avoid similar scams while continuing to support genuine organizations that help elderly people. Michael, a 31-year-old paramedic, was finishing his shift at the fire station when he received a phone call that would challenge his dedication to emergency services and teach him valuable lessons about first responder charity fraud. The caller identified himself as Captain Anderson from the Emergency Responders Support Network and immediately began explaining how they were raising funds to provide equipment and support services for paramedics, firefighters, and EMTs who were working with inadequate resources and facing increasing dangers. Michael had been working as a paramedic for 8 years and understood intimately the challenges facing emergency responders who often worked with outdated equipment, insufficient funding, and increasing call volumes that stretched emergency services to their limits. He had experienced firsthand the frustrations of trying to save lives with equipment that needed updating and working in systems that were chronically underfunded. Throughout his career, Michael had witnessed how budget constraints affected emergency services. From ambulances that needed repairs to medical equipment that was outdated or insufficient for the complex medical emergencies that paramedics faced every day. He understood the life and death importance of having proper equipment and adequate resources when responding to emergencies. Captain Anderson spoke with apparent authority about emergency services and used specific terminology related to EMS operations, firefighting equipment, and paramedic protocols that immediately established credibility with Michael. He demonstrated knowledge of the challenges facing emergency responders and spoke with apparent understanding of the technical and financial issues affecting emergency services. Michael, as a paramedic, you know better than anyone how critical it is to have the right equipment when someone's life is on the line, Anderson said with apparent respect for Michael's profession and experience. We're working with fire departments and EMS services that are trying to save lives with equipment that should have been replaced years ago, and paramedics like you are being asked to do more and more with less and less support. Captain Anderson provided detailed information about equipment needs, budget shortfalls in emergency services, and the specific challenges facing small and rural fire departments and EMS services that couldn't afford the latest life-saving equipment and training programs that larger departments had access to. The caller explained that the Emergency Responders Support Network specialized in providing grants and equipment donations to emergency services that were struggling with budget constraints and couldn't afford essential equipment upgrades that could improve their ability to save lives and protect their communities. Anderson shared specific stories about departments they had helped, including a rural fire department that had received new breathing apparatus equipment and a small-town EMS service that had been able to purchase updated cardiac monitoring equipment that had already been used to save several lives. Brother, you know that when we respond to a call, we need to have confidence that our equipment will work properly and that we have the tools necessary to do our job, Anderson continued with apparent camaraderie and professional understanding. These departments are trying to serve their communities with equipment that puts both responders and patients at risk, and that's not acceptable when lives are on the line. The caller also referenced recent emergency services news stories and equipment recalls that Michael had heard about through professional networks, demonstrating apparent knowledge of current issues affecting emergency responders and their equipment needs. Anderson asked Michael if he would be willing to make a donation to help provide essential equipment and training resources to emergency services that were struggling with inadequate funding. He offered several donation levels and explained specifically how each amount would be used to improve emergency response capabilities. A donation of $80 can help purchase emergency medical supplies that could save multiple lives, Anderson explained with apparent technical knowledge. $160 can help a department purchase communications equipment that improves coordination during emergencies. Every dollar goes directly to providing life-saving equipment and training that emergency responders desperately need. The caller also mentioned that the organization was recognized as a legitimate first responder charity and that all donations were tax-deductible. He offered to send Michael documentation about their equipment grants and provided what sounded like official emergency services organization registration numbers. Anderson also appealed to Michael's professional pride and dedication, suggesting that his donation would help fellow emergency responders provide better service to their communities and potentially save more lives with improved equipment and resources. Michael was moved by the appeal and felt a strong professional obligation to help fellow emergency responders who were trying to save lives with inadequate equipment and resources. The technical terminology and apparent understanding of emergency services issues made the organization seem completely legitimate and aligned with Michael's professional values. Michael agreed to make a $120 donation and provided his credit card information over the phone. Anderson was very appreciative and professional, thanking Michael for his dedication to emergency services and assuring him that his donation would make a real difference in improving emergency response capabilities for departments that needed help. Anderson also promised to send Michael updates about equipment purchases and training programs that had been funded with his donation and mentioned that the organization would keep him informed about ongoing needs where additional support might be beneficial. He provided Michael with a confirmation number and assured him that he would receive official documentation within a few days. After making the donation, Michael felt good about supporting fellow emergency responders and looked forward to receiving information about how his money was being used to provide essential equipment and training to departments that needed assistance. He expected to receive materials showing the impact of his contribution and updates about emergency services that had been helped. However, several weeks passed without any communication from the Emergency Responders Support Network despite Anderson's specific promises to provide updates and documentation. Michael had expected to receive thank you materials, tax receipts, and information about equipment purchases that had been made with his donation. When Michael tried to call the number Anderson had provided to inquire about his donation and request information about the departments that had been helped, he found that it was disconnected with no forwarding information. He also searched extensively online for the Emergency Responders Support Network, but couldn't find any legitimate emergency services organization with that name. Michael contacted his own fire department administration and several other local emergency services departments to ask if they had heard of the Emergency Responders Support Network or had received any equipment grants from them. None of the legitimate emergency services organizations he contacted had ever heard of the charity or received any assistance from them. Michael also contacted established first responder advocacy organizations and emergency services foundations to ask if they were familiar with the Emergency Responders Support Network. They confirmed that they had never heard of the organization and advised Michael that legitimate emergency services charities typically work through established fire and EMS networks rather than making unsolicited phone calls. Michael realized with deep anger and professional disappointment that he had been scammed by criminals who were exploiting emergency responders' dedication to their profession and their desire to help fellow first responders serve their communities more effectively. He felt particularly violated because the scammers had used his professional commitment and technical knowledge against him. Michael immediately contacted his credit card company to report the fraudulent charge and demand a refund. The customer service representative was very understanding and respectful, explaining that fake first responder charity scams are unfortunately common because scammers know that emergency responders are particularly motivated to help their colleagues and may trust appeals that use professional terminology and references. The credit card company immediately reversed the fraudulent charge and provided Michael with enhanced security measures for his account. They also explained that legitimate emergency services charities typically don't make unsolicited phone calls asking for immediate donations and provided resources for verifying first responder organizations before making contributions. Michael also reported the scam to the Federal Trade Commission, his state attorney general's office, local law enforcement, and his department's fraud prevention officer. The authorities explained that fake emergency services charity scams specifically target first responders because scammers know that emergency responders are motivated to help their colleagues and communities. The experience taught Michael to be much more careful about telephone solicitations, especially those claiming to represent emergency services organizations or first responder charities. He learned to always verify organizations through his own department leadership and established emergency services networks before making any donations. Michael continues to support legitimate first responder organizations but now researches them thoroughly through his fire department and established emergency services advocacy groups before making any donations. He has become an advocate for protecting fellow emergency responders from charity fraud and regularly shares his story with other first responders to help them avoid similar scams while continuing to support worthy causes that genuinely help emergency services and their communities. These stories demonstrate that charity fraud schemes are becoming increasingly sophisticated and targeted, exploiting people's generous hearts and specific interests to steal money intended for worthy causes. Always verify charitable organizations through independent sources, research any charity thoroughly before donating, and remember that legitimate charities never pressure you to donate immediately over the phone. Trust your instincts, take time to verify appeals independently, and continue supporting genuine charitable causes while protecting yourself from those who would exploit your generosity for personal gain.